institutional and other settings has...
We'll just leave that there because the opposition leader Bill Shorten has just begun a media conference in Canberra.
Labor is again calling upon the current Prime Minister and government to reverse the position their senators took last Thursday when the government, supported by their close allies, the One Nation political party, voted to stop a royal commission into abuse and prevention of violence against people living with disability in Australia. Today could potentially be a very exciting day. Labor's been calling since May of 2017 for a royal commission into disability to prevent violence and abuse against people living with disability. And indeed, disability advocates have been calling for a lot longer than that. We now have a chance today in the Parliament to actually right some wrongs. The reality is that a royal commission is the king of all inquiries. It has powers that no other inquiry which has looked into the question of violence against people living with disability. It has powers to summons evidence, to call witnesses, to get to the bottom of a story which a lot of people who live with disability and their families already know. People with disability aren't looking for a special deal, but they just want a fair go. And a royal commission is one of the missing ingredients to ensure that Australians living with a disability get a fair go. Even this morning, as we talk here, thousands of parents will have been taking their kids with disability to schools, and they want to make sure that their kids are safe. Last night there would have been many carers in their 70s and 80s and 90s, sleepless at midnight, full of anxiety. Who's going to care for their adult child with a disability when they can't? Now, we've set up the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but there is no doubt that there is systemic and unacceptable violence against people with a disability, bullying, abuse, and this needs to stop. What I would like to say to the current government is it is not enough for you to vote for a royal commission in the Parliament and then forget about it. And Labor and the crossbench and indeed people with disability and their families and carers and the people who love them won't let you. But it is not enough to have a token vote in the Parliament to endorse a royal commission into disability just because you're afraid of losing the vote. We will get a good outcome, but not for a good reason. The government's divided. They're divided on a whole range of issues. They've stopped governing and they're scared of Parliament. At least on this issue, let's do something about the people rather than ourselves. A Royal Commission on Disability is we can work on the terms of reference between government and opposition and, of course, most importantly, people living with a disability and their families. We know that abuse has occurred in the past. We know that if nothing changes, the chances are abuse will occur in the future. When politicians have the power to stop the abuse, and we don't, then we're partly therefore responsible for what happens next. So I say to the government, it's not enough to have a token vote. It's now necessary to set up the Royal Commission. Labor will work with you. And even if you're having the vote because you're a divided government and lost control of the Parliament, for goodness sakes, for the tens of thousands of people, the hundreds of thousands of people living with profound and severe disability, for all their families and carers, we need to do something different, and this Royal Commission will be the circuit breaker which people have been calling for many years. I'd now like to invite my colleagues to speak and some disability advocates. Dougie, over to you.
Sure.
Stand with Dougie.
Hello, if you're just joining, this is a media conference live from Canberra. I've just heard from the opposition leader, and this is about the calls for a royal commission into the disability sector.
It's up to 200 people with disability and their families who all receive support through the National Disability Insurance Scheme, a scheme that we all know. Bill Shorten played an important part in setting up with his team 7 years ago. I'm here to say, on behalf of, I think, many people with disability and their families around Australia, that this call for a Royal Commission into abuse is something that is overdue, much needed, and I think will tell Australians a truth about a darker side of our community and our history than many of us realise is part of our Australian history. We need to work together, I hope across parliamentary boundaries and lines, to work in the interests of all people with disability and their families, because abuse is real. It's happened in the past. It's crystal clear that someone somewhere will be abused today because they're vulnerable and in a vulnerable situation. And unless the Commission can open up the door to a better future, we know it will happen in the future. I'm very proud to be here with politicians who've tried in the past to get a Royal Commission up. I think Jordan in the Senate, who has pushed this since he arrived, needs to be commended for all the work that he has done. But I think we need to remember that the Prime Minister himself said just 2 days ago that we need to do everything we can to support people with disability. Well, today is a day for action, not just warm words. And I think people with disability and their families all over the country want to not just see a vote, they want to see action, and we want to see it now, because this is a dark secret that needs to be brought out into the light so that we can all build a better future for people we love, for people we are, and people we support. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Dougie.
Sorry.
Okay, just once again, if you're joining us, this is a media conference with the opposition leader Bill Shorten, Tanya Plibersek standing there alongside him, and disability advocates. The opposition leader has just called for the government to, in fact, commit to setting up a Royal Commission into the disability sector. We've got Linda Burney speaking there now as well.
My federal colleagues and Dougie, and this is Katie, everyone, who has shared with us her story today. And Katie, thank you so much for being here. You're a wonderful young woman and we are very proud of you. I don't think I need to add very much to what Bill has said this morning, except to say that this cannot be just waved through the Parliament by the Morrison government this afternoon. We need to see the terms of reference, we need to see proper funding allocated and a really strong commitment to this Royal Commission, and it is now. We know the time has come. The clock has stopped ticking for Scott Morrison. The time has come for him to do some really decent things by these wonderful people that have joined us today. This needs to be broad-ranging. It needs to cover education, it needs to cover health, it needs to cover things like rehabilitation, and it also needs to look into historical abuse as well. So thank you, everyone. I'll hand it now back to my colleagues, and thank you, Katie, for being here today, and thank you.
Thanks, Linda.